donor.
Sorry.
That's right. Of donor and transplant services in Anthony Nolan, or DTS. So, because we're one of many teams that make up that donor journey to transplant. Next slide, please. So within DTS, there are other teams that we work really closely with that make this journey from finding a donor to getting to a transplant happen. So what search are involved in is everything kind of within this red box. So we will receive a request from a UK transplant centre or one of our overseas registries to search for matched unrelated donors, or MUDs, as they're sometimes called. So first we search the UK, and if there aren't any great options, then that's when we'll search the rest of the world for a donor for our patients. And we'll go over that in more detail in a minute. But this graphic helps to show where we sit within DTS in our organisation. So one of the other teams that we're very much linked to is the VT team, and they organise all the verification typing for any Anthony Nolan donors that we may want to look out for our patients. And we also request VTs from all donors abroad, either via email or via a secure messaging system called MDIS. So the VT team and any VT teams for overseas registries are the ones who will actually contact donors, track them down and make appointments for blood draws and that kind of thing. Whereas search team find the appropriate donors, but we don't actually speak to them ourselves. And then once search and VT have done their bit, that's when we pass it on to donor provision and workups, and they facilitate the rest of that donor's journey up until a transplant. So next slide, please. So this is a list of all of the UK transplant centres that we deal with at Anthony Nolan. So they're all hospitals in the UK, but not all hospitals are transplant centres. So within our team of about 13 people, we cover all of these centres and any overseas registries that send us a request for a patient. So they're divided up based on their workload. So for example, currently I coordinate all the searches for Great Ormond Street and Leeds. So, and then other coordinators will have their own ones assigned to them who they deal with on a daily basis. So this means that we build up quite a good relationship with the clinical teams and those at the transplant centre that we email every day. And they're the ones that we email and they send us their patients and ask us for searches to be run. And then for all of these TCs, we will search the UK aligned registries, which includes Anthony Nolan and NHSBT and Welsh Blood Services. So they all have their own register of donors, which we have a look at in the UK. However, for overseas patients, we only search the Anthony Nolan register because they look at their own searches and decide who they want to request, and we don't act as a coordinator for them in the same way. So we can go on the next slide, please.
Phoebe, we've just had a quick question on the chat about what VT stands for. It's verification typing, isn't it?
Yeah, verification typing. So donors, when they're signed up to a register, will be typed so that we can see if there'll be a match for a patient, and that's how we search for them. But then that is verified by a VT sample, which is a small blood sample, and they just check that all that typing was done correctly and we're not going to end up with someone that's not matched later down the line. So this here is typically what a search request looks like for us. And so we'll be emailed something that looks like this from one of our transplant centres. The rest of the form, which is cut off at the bottom, has basically a massive grid of ethnicities on it, which some TCs don't fill out, but basically all the information we have to have for a search to go ahead is on the top part of this form. And not all of this information is essential, but to do a search, we have to have a minimum of a name, a date of birth, sex, diagnosis, and HLA. And the HLA is like that patient's typing, which is often on a separate form. And then if we don't have any of this information, we have to go back to the transplant center and ask for it before we can proceed with a search. Sometimes we also have to check the diagnosis of the patient with the BSM-BT, which is the British Society of Blood and Marrow Transplantation. And if it's not been approved by them as a diagnosis, which might need a transplant, then we have to ask them for more information or run this by our medical officer, who can approve things that we might not be able to ourselves in search team. And very rarely we can refuse a search, but it's pretty unlikely. Other information which we can get on this form that isn't essential is things like blood group or CMV status. So we often like to have these if we can for a patient, because it helps us find an even better match for them if possible, but we don't need these things to run a search. Next slide, please. So at this stage, we'll complete the UK search for our patient. So this is an example of what our system looks like when we're doing a search in the UK. So we can see on this screenshot that I've put up that we're searching for what we call a 10 out of 10 HLA matched donor. And so these are people who match our patient at all 10 loci that we're looking at for HLA. When we talk about finding a 10 out of 10 match, we're talking about HLA A, B, C, DRB1 and DQB1, which we can see across the top here. And then sometimes we can find donors that are a 12 out of 12 match if we include that final one of DP, but that's not what we're aiming for, because a lot of people, we struggle to even find a 10 out of 10. And that's because there are millions of combinations of HLA genes. So far, over 5,000 different genes have been found. So, and the chance of finding a match can be population specific as well. We can also see at the bottom, even though this patient has 5 potential donors in the UK, this bottom match is quite unlikely to actually be a match for our donor if we did verification type them, because we're missing quite a few loci and they've got what we call low resolution typing. So there could be anything following the O2 in that bit where it says XX. So we don't know if they are actually going to be a match. They just could be. So for this patient, I'd also run what we call a mismatch search to see if they have any good 9 out of 10s. And the preference for lots of TCs is often to have an HLA-A mismatch, if at all. So that's what our UK search would look like. And then after we've done a UK search, we would go on and complete an international search of all the other registries. Next slide, please. So to do an international search, we use a different system. So this is the WMDA, which is the World Marrow Donor Association website, and they hold a list of all the donors registered globally by any registry in the world. So we can see on this example that we have lots of really good donors for this patient worldwide, potentially. So the top ones here, the top one is actually an Anthony Nolan donor, but we can see we've got really good options in the US and Poland and Germany, which is quite common for white British people. We're pretty well matched with the US and Germany a lot of the time. And then, so in this case, there are actually over 2,000 brilliant donors worldwide for this patient, which is where additional information like CMV or blood group might come in, because we can then filter down this list and find people that are matched for even more criteria than just HLA matching and find a better donor. Mostly TCs, transplant centres do like us to filter for CMV if they have that available, because a CMV matched donor has often a better outcome for their patient. Doesn't really matter if they're positive or negative, but as long as they're matched. And research also suggests that donors under the age of 30 can provide a better outcome for our patients. So we often have a preference for young donors, CMV matched donors, and potentially men if we possibly can, because they tend to be larger, so they can provide a greater number of cells and a more successful transplant for our patients. Next slide, please. So sometimes not all of our searches are as positive when we're looking on the international registries. So this one here, we can see they don't really have any great options for a 10 out of 10 match worldwide. And the likelihood of finding a match on a register is dictated by a few different things, including the size of the register, the ethnic mix of the register and the patient's ethnicity, and the frequency of the patient's HLA alleles in that population. So we can see here there are only 2 potentially matched donors in the world for this patient, according to WMDA's algorithm. However, sadly, even the top donor seems to be quite a poor option for our patient, because they have what we call serological typing, which is quite an old version of typing, which was done kind of early 90s and in the 80s. And we can also see that this donor is aged at the top of our age bracket for accepting donors on the register, because we remove anyone after they pass the age of 60. So sometimes we have cases where there are poor 10 out of 10 options, but there are really good 9 out of 10s. So 9 out of 10s are also a viable source of a donor for lots of patients, although this particular patient didn't have great 9 out of 10s either. And one of the huge contributing factors to this is ethnicity a lot of the time. Because HLA is hereditary, it's far more likely that you find a match of an unrelated donor from a similar ethnic background to yourself. And currently, white patients have a 71% chance of finding a match, but this drops to about 37% chance for patients from minority ethnic backgrounds. Next slide, please. So not all hope is lost when we can't find an adult donor for our patients. So we can sometimes have a look for cord blood units as well. Not all transplant centres are confident with cord, so they don't always use it, but this is definitely an option. We have a register of cord blood units ourselves at Anthony Nolan, but so does the NHS, and so do hundreds of other cord banks worldwide. So cord is from the umbilical cords of placentas. So it's the leftover blood in those after a baby's been born, and it just has loads of stem cells in it. So they're also another viable option as a donor for our patients sometimes. And due to the fact that those stem cells in there are more immature than adult stem cells, they don't need to be as well matched to a patient. So it gives us more flexibility finding a match, particularly for those who have very rare HLA or from an ethnic minority where they might not have an adult donor who matches them on any register worldwide. It's also a good option if we have urgent patients, because the cells are already available and we're not trying to track down a donor that we might not be able to get hold of. Next slide, please. So we also look on WMDA for cords as well. And we can see that it looks quite different from an adult search, but we're looking at a few different things. We're not just looking at their HLA match for cords. We're looking at how many cells of different types that we want are in there as well, which I won't go into because cords really confusing, but they are things like TNC is how many cells we've got in there that we're looking at, and CD34 marks the types of stem cells that we're looking for. So these are why cords are a little bit confusing and not always used. And we also need the weight of a patient to do a cord search, which we don't for an adult donor search, because we need certain numbers of cells to reach thresholds per kilogram of from a cord blood unit, and we can't go back to that person and ask for more cells like we can for an adult sometimes. Next slide, please. So when we've done our UK search and our international search and potentially a cord blood search, we compile all these reports and we send them off to our transplant centres, and then they use our reports to select which donors they might want to verification type for their patient. So we request all of these, and we normally get asked for it on a form that looks like this, where the transplant centre will put their patient information, and then where it says grids are what we call donor IDs, so we can find the donors that we're looking for from their grid and request them from the right register. When a verification typing request is made, that's when the donor is contacted by that team and they're told they're a potential match for a patient, and then they provide their availability and they're booked in for a blood draw appointment just to give that sample that we can check they're definitely a match. So the samples of their blood are taken and sent to the labs of our transplant centres, and then they get to make sure that they're happy that they're a match before the process goes any further. Next slide, please. So this is an example of some of the information we get back after we've verification typed a donor. So whilst we're typing their HLA at the TC labs, the register the donor is from provide us with what's called IDMs, which are independent disease markers. So we basically want to see most of these are negative, and that the CMV status matches our patient. And they also like to look to check that the CMV test date was pretty recent, because someone who might have been negative could potentially be positive now. And some centres also request additional typing, such as EBV, and this varies depending on the transplant centre, because different clinicians have found different outcomes depending on what their preferences are and how they treat their patients. We also do find that when we request VTs, sometimes the donor is ineligible medically, or they might not be available because they could just be on holiday or pregnant or just otherwise engaged. And some donors we can't get in contact with, so they are deleted from the register. In this circumstance, our TCs often have to request more donors just to make sure that they can get some samples and proceed with that transplant. Next slide, please. So that covers the basics of kind of what we do every day as a search coordinator. But due to our close relationship with the TCs as their specific coordinator, we do spend a lot of time sort of troubleshooting for them as well, and dealing with other things that come up during this process. Next slide, please. So a lot of our time is taken up with queries that they may have about donors or cords or anything else that they've asked for, and chasing up samples. And we also feed back to our TC when we hear about the donor from a registry, help with questions and liaising between all the different core banks and all of the different registers for them. We also have a service called Gaius, which is run by some of our senior coordinators for transplant centres that want a little bit more help, where we provide advice on which donors we think they should go for, which cords we think that they could pick, and that kind of thing, and keeping track of all of their requests and suggesting when to pick backups. We also provide repeat searches for patients who we can't find a donor for, just in case anyone new has been added to the worldwide registers since the last time we searched. And then once the case goes beyond search, our donor provision team take over, and that patient can go to work up with a donor and then hopefully have their transplant. Next slide, please. And that's everything that search and selection coordinator does, really. Were there lots of questions in the chat? I couldn't see it pinging off as I was talking.
So, what proportion of matches involve transnational action? Tony, you asked that question.
We do an international search for pretty much all of our patients, even if they do end up going with a UK donor. But I don't know what percentage exactly, but I would say the majority are definitely overseas donors, because it just has we have a much larger pool to choose from when we look overseas as well.
Mary has asked, how do these forms compare with the forms for matching donors when the Anthony Nolan register began? So I'm guessing, Mary, you're thinking about sort of how things have evolved over the years.
Yeah, so, well, one thing that will have changed will be that historically donors were matched based out of 6. So that was just on A, B, and DR rather than A, B, C, DR, and DQ. So we won't have had as much information on their HLA when we used to search them. And then different things come up all the time, like trying to match CMV, and with there being cord now, which is a newer graph source, we need things like their weight and that kind of thing. So we possibly need more information now than ever to be able to make a good selection.
Zella has asked, if after an international search there are no matches, what happens?
Well, if there's no matches at all, then there's a couple of options. You could either have a cord search and find some sort of cord that's matched to you, because they don't need to be as matched as an adult donor would have to be. There's also other options kind of before coming to us, like related donors. Sometimes we help facilitate siblings that live abroad and might be able to be a match for a patient or other family members. We've had aunties and uncles living all over the world that are willing to give a blood sample that we can type and see if they'll be a match. But if there really is no one related or unrelated and no cords, there just isn't, transplant probably isn't going to happen for that patient, which is sad. But yeah, I think that's when we hope that other cures can work for them and that they won't need the transplant.
Is that where like CAR-T therapy comes in?
Yeah,
things like that. So Alan's, he had a transplant 10 years ago. Originally, the first donor was in the US, but couldn't donate for 3 months. Is that correct, Alan? Am I reading this correctly? You can unmute if you would prefer. A new search found his actual 1010 donor. Why would he not have been found originally? He was in the UK.
Interesting. Well, it probably will have depended on other factors about that donor. So if there were 2 potential donors, the American one and the UK one, and say the American one was younger, or they were matched at other sites that we can sometimes look at with your HLA, like DP, which we don't always look at, or maybe they were a CMV match, or a blood group match, or anything else that they were looking at as well. Or if they were a male, they may have prioritized them. So it's not always just on whether they're a 10 out of 10 or not. They may have been younger and therefore favoured. And then the UK donor may have been a backup that we used that was a bit older.
Okay. Has anybody else got any other questions?
Just to follow up on that question I asked earlier, I must admit, my expectation, my assumption was that the majority of UK patients will find their match from the UK register. But from what you were saying, Phoebe, it's probably a majority that come from overseas. Is that right?
It's whatever's the best match, really.
Yeah.
So we don't limit it on where they are if there's a better donor abroad. And a lot of the time, with kind of increasing diversity across all countries as well, a lot of our patients, say for example, may be from Pakistan, so then their best donor will be in India, but the likelihood of them finding someone who's ethnically Pakistani that lives in the UK is lower. So it is dictated a lot by your ethnic background as well. So we don't necessarily have all the donors in the UK that will match our patients all the time. But yeah, in some cases we'll prioritize a UK donor, say if the transplant's really urgent, because we know we can get them quicker. But most of the time it's whoever's best wherever they are.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I just ask a question?
Yes.
Sorry. One of the questions I've been asked when I do presentations, one of the students asked me the other day, if there's a donor who is a match in, say, South America, does Anthony Nolan pay for all that transportation of the stem cells, or do the airlines or whatever, do they let them on the planes free when they're taking it away?
So the register, who are the people that deal with the donor, they invoice Anthony Nolan, and we deal with all of that for their couriers and for their costs of their people that are collecting their cells in their hospitals and that kind of thing before they're then sent to the UK. And then the transplant centres in the UK pay us back, basically, as and when. So it's not free, but it's the register charges the transplant centre, but we sort of facilitate that.
One of our volunteers, Alan, you're a volunteer courier, aren't you? Sorry to put you on the spot, but you might be. And Peter, are you? You're a volunteer courier.
Yeah, I was, yes. I did 375 trips. I was going to ask a question about that. I did 375 trips for Anthony Nolan in a period of 8 years, on an average 1 a week. And you showed a list of all the hospitals in the UK that are transplant centres. I think I've taken stem cells to all, bone marrow to all of them. But my question that I was going to ask was, how many different countries are now registered, are part of the worldwide register? Do you know, Phoebe?
Almost all of them, really. Some of the places that we have not a register in every country would be, say, in Africa. We don't have a register in every country, but there are a few generic African registers. But some countries have multiple registers within them. So I think in Germany there's about 3 different registers, and then in the UK there's a few as well. So there's possibly a similar number of registers as there are countries, but some countries don't have one, or have one in a neighbouring country, and some have a few.
Interesting. Thank you.
So just going back to Zella's point, Alan, you volunteer courier for us, don't you? So it entails, if you just correct me if I'm wrong, this is just information for the Zellas. So you go to the transplant centre and you collect the stem cells from the donor, and then you put them into a refrigerated box.
Yes, that's right.
And then you take them wherever they need to go. So whether that's down to London or around the world to South Africa or wherever.
Well, it tends to be. Peter has done a lot more trips than me, but if it's a foreign one, you go abroad to pick it up from abroad, right, and then bring it back to the UK and deliver it where it's needed in the UK. But obviously it could be picking up in Barnsley and bringing to Manchester, or picking up somewhere and going to somewhere else in the UK. But the foreign ones almost always are picking up abroad and bringing back to the UK.
Yeah.
And in terms of that, Anthony Nolan provide you with all your flight tickets? And...
Yeah, the office books flights and accommodation, and the courier pays for train fares, incidentals, meals, and then submits an expense claim, and then Anthony Nolan presumably recharge that to whoever's paying for it.
Yeah. Does that help with your question there, Zala?
It was a subject that came up in, as I say, in one of my presentations, and the students were just keen to know what would go, how it actually worked, you know. So yeah, certainly, if I get the question again.
You certainly don't get airlines providing you with free tickets.
That seems a great shame, because I know, well, as far as I was aware, if there is organ transplants going on, then the couriers are sort of given first choice of going, sort of thing, and even free transport I've heard of. So I'm surprised that maybe it isn't the same for donor transplants.
Well, it's not something that I and presumably Peter get involved with at all.
No.
We just put our names down for whichever trip we want to do. You know, it might be Germany back to Manchester, and once we're allocated that trip and it's going ahead, then the office will just notify us of what flights we're getting and where we're staying. We're as couriers, we're not involved with the booking of that at all.
Yeah.
And as far as organ donation is concerned, as far as I'm aware, organ donation, when an organ has to be transported from one place to another, is a very limited amount of time. An organ doesn't last nearly as long as stem cells do. So organ transport usually just happens within this country. I don't think there's much organ transport that goes across borders, as far as I know.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you. Yeah.
Yes.
So has anybody got any more questions for Phoebe? No. Okay, well, then that concludes the sort of spotlight on search and selection. If you do think of anything else, if you do think of any other questions that you have after the today, then please just drop me an email and I'll forward them to Phoebe and we can get you the answer. It has been recorded, so once the recording link is all sorted and it's uploaded to the YouTube channel, I shall share that link with you and the presentation. But yeah, thank you so much everybody for coming, and thank you to Phoebe for presenting about search and selection.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.